Hey everybody, welcome back to Tenza Motorsports. Today I want to go over why I chose a 330 Ci versus an M3. Now, normally this would be not very controversial if you're talking about leaving both cars stock. Okay, which kind of driving you're going to be doing? Is it going to be track driving? Is it just driving back and forth to work? And if you're doing a lot of track driving, then I would clearly say to get the M3 over the 330. But if you're just popping in and out of autocross every now and then, a 330 would be just fine. And that goes for the coupes or the sedans. I don't regularly advertise the 325s and the 328s, mostly because they're within, a certain price range that is very comparable to a 330. So you can find a 325 and for maybe even less than $1,000 more, you can get a 330. So I would always tell everybody to get the 330 if you can get your hands on one, especially if you can find one in good condition. Now, in my case, I got mine really cheap. I think I've mentioned this before a couple times on the channel. I paid $1,500 for my car. I got it from a sheriff's impound lot. The previous owner got the car impounded for running drugs, and that's how I got the car. So that kind of explains why I chose a 330 versus an M3, because most M3s, even cheap ones, can be $7 or $8,000. And I got this one for $1,500, and a normal 330 you can find for around $4 to $5 pretty easy, and you can find really nice ones for closer to the cheaper M3, so around $7, $8,000 you can find ones really nice. So that leads us to the next question. Why didn't I spend as much on this car as it would be to buy a really nice M3? Really nice M3s can start around the mid to high teens, low 20s, easy. You can get a really nice one for $25. So why did I spend $20,000 on this when I could have just bought an M3? Now, if you look at it from the price point of having to add all these parts to an M3, it starts to get really expensive. A supercharger for this car is $7,000, a supercharger for an M3 is $10,000. And I get a lot of people that say, well, this car supercharged is about the same as an M3. And we'll come back around to that because I want to talk about the power and weight differences between this car and an M3 specifically. But when you start adding a wing and bucket seats and really nice tires, things like that, that's going to go on to the purchase price of your M3. Let's just say that you found an M3 for around $10,000. Well, you're starting at $10,000 instead of $1,500. And like I said, a lot of other 330s you can find for around $4,000 or $5,000. So it's double just to get the M3. Now I priced out an M3 that would have started around $10,000 and put all the parts on this onto one of those, and I ended up at around $35,000, which is $15,000 more than this. And that's about another 100 horsepower more than what I'm running and about the same foot-pounds of torque. This is actually a very torquey engine compared to the 3.2 liter straight six it sits in the E46 M3s. The other reason I didn't pick an M3 is because I was worried about getting roasted for modifying it like this. It's kind of a double-edged sword. So if you get a 330 and do all the performance stuff to it, then people just think that you're faking an M3, and if you do it to an M3, then people get mad that you're ruining a future classic. And as we know, the E46 M3 is on the fast track to becoming a classic car. The previous generations of the M3, the E30 and the E36, are just continuing to climb. Every year there's a model year of the 36 that becomes a classic, 25 years old, and they are slowly but surely going up, and these are next on the list. So I felt like if I got an M3 and did something like this to it, that I would just get roasted online anyways. Why are you ruining an M3? You could have kept it and just restored it, made it nice, and that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted an actual dedicated race car. I've got a dedicated daily driver. I don't need something that's all back to original. I wanted one that was made for track. And that's why I decided to do this 3 Series, because then I wasn't having to fight people that were worried about me ruining an M3. Another comment that I want to go over a little bit is I get a lot of people that are saying that I'm faking an M3. I'm obviously not faking M3. Nowhere on my car does it say M3. None of the video titles of my videos say M3 anywhere like that. Now, I do say M3 conversion if I'm using M3 parts on this car, or something that would be comparable to an M3, like the fender flares and stuff like that are the same width as an M3, I'll say then. But the car nowhere says M3 on it. In fact, in multiple places it says 330 Ci. So in no way am I trying to fake an M3 in any way. But the fact that the car looks like an M3 just shows you how performance-oriented the M3s are. The wider fenders, the bulge in the hood, the bigger mouth on the front bumper. And I've talked about this in previous videos too, that the bigger mouth I bought because I knew eventually I was going to go either turbocharged or supercharged, and I wanted that mouth at the bottom. So one other thing before we get into this car versus an M3, if we're looking at them side by side, I've got another buddy who does YouTube. I'll leave his channel link in the description below. He's actually building an M3 GTR replica. Now, he started with a 325 because he found a really low mileage one, and he found it for a really good price. So if you're building an M3 GTR, the downside to starting with an M3 is you kind of ruin everything that makes it an M3 to begin with. The cars are already old, so the first thing you're probably going to end up doing is replacing the suspension and the tires if they haven't been replaced already. If you put the wide body on it, then there's no reason to have your front and rear fenders. If you remove the engine to put some sort of BMW V8 or maybe an LS swap into it, like the M3 GTRs have, the V8 in them, then you've removed the engine, and if you strip the interior, there's nothing left of an M3. At that point, it wouldn't matter what E46 you started with because you're going to end up with a wide-body V8 stripped interior race car. And if you do that to an M3, you're just going to get roasted online that you've ruined an M3. And if you do it with a non-M car, you're just going to get roasted online that you're trying to fake being an M car. So it's a bit of a lose-lose situation, and this isn't to bag on anybody who wants to buy an E46 M3 and keep it completely stock, or just maybe do some CSL, carbon fiber bits on it, which is totally fine. I absolutely love the way those look, but if you're trying to do something a little bit more intense, something like this, it's better to start with a cheaper non-M 3 Series than it is to go into the M range and see if you can't snag one. Even a cheaper one, like I said, can be $7 or $8 grand. Now when it comes to reliability, they're pretty on par with each other. The M3 can be a little bit more fussy when it comes to the Vanos system and even valve adjustments, I've heard. Again, I don't have any experience on that. I've never actually owned an M car. So we've owned lots of BMWs, but I've never owned an M3 or an M4, anything like that. I haven't even owned like the new BMWs where they're doing the M240 or anything like that. This was an M Sport when it was new, and I've had a 1 Series that was an M Sport. My other 3 Series was an M Sport. So I've owned M Sport cars, but that really only gives you like wheels and the M logo on your shift knob and stuff like that. It's not really much more performance compared to another E46 that doesn't have the M Performance package in it. So let's compare this car to an M3. Now we're going to use a stock M3 because if you start to modify it too much, obviously it will be faster because it starts off faster. But if you're just looking at a stock M3 versus this car, I want to go back to before I had done any modifications to this car, back to when it was stock. First thing I did to this car was strip it out. That's free, it's easy to do, and you can lose a ton of weight. And if I take the dyno numbers for this car, which was 192 and 222 pound-feet of torque, don't ask me where that 222 pound-feet of torque came from. The car's not supposed to produce that much, but that's what it ended up dynoing. I have a buddy that's local who dynoed an M3, and he ended up getting 270 horsepower and 250 pound-feet of torque. So if you take this car here and you minus 550 pounds off that, it actually ends up being 100 pounds per 10 horsepower. So if you lose 500 pounds off your car, it's equivalent to adding 50 horsepower. And I always thought that was kind of a crazy number to think that every 100 pounds you take out of the car is adding 10 horsepower. So if you've got a passenger in there and they get out, if they weigh 200 pounds, it's equivalent to adding 20 horsepower based on what you were just driving before. And again, I didn't think that it was that much until I started to actually beat the M3s on the track because I had done a weight reduction. So my car was actually beating M3s on the track after a 500 pound weight reduction, wider rims and tires, and suspension. So for around 2,500 bucks, you can get your 330 to beat a stock M3. Now obviously if the M3 goes out and puts super sticky tires on their car and they start weight reduction, you can't keep up with that. Because that car starts out with 70 or 80 horsepower more, it's very difficult for your car to be able to keep up with that. But a lot of people aren't willing to go through and modify the M3s like we said earlier. And so you can actually make your 330 faster than a lot of M3s or on par with an M3 by just doing a weight reduction, wider wheels and tires, and suspension. And you won't feel nearly as bad about stripping out the interior of a car that costs $4,000 versus stripping out the interior of a car that costs upwards of $50,000 if the car was in perfect condition. And I actually had a hard time stripping the interior out of this. You feel like crap the entire time you're stripping the interior out because there's nothing really wrong with it. I've done 4 cars now. I've done this car, we did our blue E30, we did the white E36, and I've done our E36 kart car. And out of all 4 of those cars, there's only one of them that I actually didn't feel sick to my stomach pulling the interior out, and that was the convertible kart car, because the interior was so bad that it didn't matter if it was out or not. In fact, if we were going to completely restore that car, that was the first steps to that car anyways, was stripping it all the way down and starting over. It was that bad. But the interior of this car, besides a couple of rips on the front seat and maybe some steering wheel repairs, it really wasn't that bad on the inside. Same with the other white E36. It needed a new pair of front seats and maybe a steering wheel. The E30, same thing. Go through, clean it up, new front seats maybe, and a new steering wheel, because that's really what goes out on these cars the fastest, is the driver's seat and the steering wheel. And so I had a really hard time pulling the interior out because it wasn't in bad condition, but I knew deep down at the starting price of $1,500 that I probably wasn't going to find another one for cheaper, and this was going to be the car that if I was going to build a race car and strip, this would be the one to do it. So hopefully that gives a little bit of insight to my thinking and my reasoning of why I did what I did versus buying an M3 and starting there. It's really just that price difference. The supercharger is about 2 or 3 grand more, and the purchase price of a car can be 5 to 10 grand more for an M3. So right off the bat, even on the cheap side, you're looking at something that would be $7,000 or $8,000 more to get into. Realistically, my dream garage would probably have an E46 M3 race car, and then maybe an E46 M3 just a standard car. A good pair of those cars would probably cost you around 55 grand. If I spend around 35 building the one race car and 20 something finding a nice, good, clean M3. But for 55 grand, I can buy this car, the lift, the kart car above me, my 1 Series daily driver, the X3 that's across the garage over there, and my enclosed trailer. So for the price of those 2 cars, I can own a whole bunch of other stuff. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. And that's really, again, that's the reason why I didn't do an M3 is that big price difference between them. If you're gonna do an M3, I would really just tell you, find one that's in good condition. I personally wouldn't go and find one that's like perfect condition, like super low mileage, because I do feel like you would be ruining a car that, if it isn't already really expensive, it's gonna be expensive in a classic. I would go and find one that needs a little bit of TLC. Maybe go and find one that's already had, its door smashed in or something where it was cheap to get, it's already got a damaged title, this does not have a clean title, and build it from there. Basically pump life back into one. Nobody can really fault you for doing a race car M3 if the car was essentially almost worthless when you got it. But I really think that the older these cars get, the more flack somebody would get for buying a really nice, good condition E46 M3 and then ripping the interiors to shreds like we did on this car and then making a track car out of it. So that's probably my biggest piece of advice to somebody who really just wants an E46 M3. They don't care what everybody else thinks. Just stick with that mindset. Don't let anybody bother you about it. I gave you my advice. I'd go find one that needs a little bit of TLC and start from there. But if you want to go and find one that's in really good condition and do it, just let the haters hate, do what you want to do. So what's everybody's opinion? Did I make a mistake doing it to a 330? Should I have done it to an M3? Leave all your comments in the comment section below. If you have any questions about anything, if you want to see any more content on this car, I can definitely do that. I've got a lot of video ideas coming up. There's a lot more content coming up on this car and the E36 Death Cart, so stay tuned for that. I appreciate everybody for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button, subscribe if you're new. My Patreon link is in the description below. I want to say thanks to all of my Patreons. It's been amazing and it's a great community. I'm going to be having more things available to my Patreon. Right now it's a little bit lame, but I'm going to be having pre-released videos and private links available to my Patreon members so you can actually see content before it gets released on YouTube. I record close to 2 months out. So the video you're seeing now was probably recorded close to 2 months ago. And if you're on my Patreon, you're seeing it really quickly. So it's been really fun to have that community there. Again, the link to that is in the description below. And until next time, everybody, we'll see you in the next video.